Hi, this is the Ecomodernist channel live, and this is Gabe Ignetti. And we're back with Robert Zubrin. And Robert Zubrin is an American aerospace engineer, author, and advocate for human exploration of Mars. He is a founder of the Mars Society. He has played a leadership role in the National Space Society, and he was the driving force behind Mars Direct, a proposal intended to produce significant reductions in the cost and complexity of colonizing Mars. He's the author of The Case for Mars and many other books about our future in space. Robert, welcome to our program.
Thanks for inviting me.
Good to have you on. So, could we start by telling us about the Mars Society and why we need to go to Mars?
The Mars Society is an international organization committed to furthering the exploration and settlement, founded in 1998. Got chapters in about 40 countries. Our biggest is the United States. But we have chapters in every major country you can think of. We have a chapter in Kurdistan and a chapter in Ukraine, as well as chapters in places like France and the UK and so forth. We do three things. One is broad public outreach to spread the vision. The second is political work to attempt to defend the various Mars programs that the government's funding or thinking of funding. And the third is projects of our own, of which the most significant have been to build private, basically we call Mars analog research stations. These are things that look like Mars habitats. We have one in the Canadian Arctic and one in the American desert, where we send crews to practice Mars missions in these Mars-like deserts. And by so doing, learn what's likely to work well on Mars.
Great. So could you tell us a little bit about Mars Direct and what that concept is?
Sure. Mars Direct was a plan that was developed by a team of engineers led by me and another engineer named David Baker at the Martin Marietta Company, which is now Lockheed Martin. And this was in responsible to the massive screw up of the so-called NASA 90-day report. In 1989, President Bush called for the first President Bush called for sending people back to the moon and on to Mars. And NASA went off and concocted the most complex plan you could possibly imagine to carry this out with a $400 billion price tag. It killed the initiative, sticker shock in Congress. And the reason why the plan was so bad was that basically the people running the plan regarded the various technologists in the space community not as their vendors, but as their constituents. And they basically created the most complex plan you possibly could in order to make everybody happy. And that's exactly the wrong way to run a business. It's the wrong way to do engineering. If you run a business, you're not in business to make your vendors happy. You buy judiciously from the vendors you need. You don't just try to make all the vendors in the world happy by giving them money. That would be insanity. And yet that is how the 90-day report was designed. So Baker and I and our team designed the most disciplined mission. And we managed to do it without needing any orbital assembly or any orbital assembly stations, or any orbital refueling, any orbital rendezvous of any kind, any advanced propulsion. It was direct launch to Mars with a launch vehicle in the class of the Saturn V, which was the moon rocket we had used in the Apollo. And the key trick was to make use of Martian materials, in particular the CO2 and water, to make methane oxygen return propellant on Mars. And this cut the mass of the mission by about a factor of 5 and eliminated the need for giant orbital assemblies and all this other stuff. So basically the philosophy was travel light, live off the land. That's how people have explored successfully on Earth. Make use of the resources that are available in the environment you intend to operate in. That was the spirit of Mars Direct. And it didn't need lunar bases either, or lunar orbiting space stations, or a whole bunch of other stuff that people wanted to inject into the mission plan. And and looked at in the spring of 1990 when we put it forth. This was Humans to Mars by 1999. And in fact, that's how it was covered in Aerospace America. And in certain ways, it was the most radical Mars plan that anybody was proposing. And in other ways, it was the most conservative, because it was radical in the sense that it broke from the von Braun paradigm of on-orbit assembly of giant spaceships and advanced propulsion, all sorts of other stuff. But it was the most conservative, precisely because it didn't use all this futuristic stuff. We didn't make use of this whole parallel universe of orbital space constructions. And the plan was immediately controversial. We had a lot of support in NASA and even among our competitors, Martin's competitors, Boeing, and so forth, and also a lot of opposition. And it's been controversial ever since. Now, a version of it has been embraced by Elon Musk as the basis of his Starship plan to Mars. He does direct launch to Mars, no orbital assembly. He does do orbital refueling, but the whole plan is enabled by making the return propellant methane oxygen on the surface of Mars, exactly as I outlined in the Mars Direct plan. The whole plan is written up in great detail in my book, The Case for Mars.
The whole thing become politicized, really. This has been a historic problem with NASA. It's even been a problem with the military, from what I understand, that's a big reason why a lot of weapon systems and things have been built that they didn't even want.
It's a characteristic problem that recurs. It's not always the case, either in NASA or the military, but it is a pathology that is there waiting for them. And the distinction that I draw is between purpose-driven programs and vendor-driven programs. Purpose-driven programs spend money to do things. Vendor-driven programs do things in order to spend money. And if you look at the history of NASA or the military or a variety of other government institutions, you will see examples of both. And Apollo was purpose-driven. The purpose wasn't scientific, but it was purpose-driven. It was to astonish the world with what free people could do. NASA's science program, for the most part today, remains purpose-driven. They didn't do the Webb Space Telescope in order to give contracts to various vendors. They didn't send the rovers to Mars in order to give money to the airbag industry. So those are purpose-driven programs. And when they do them, despite all the other inefficiencies that get involved with government programs and bureaucracies and so forth, they can do amazing things, and they have. On the other hand, some other programs, including, for instance, the current Artemis program, is being run as a vendor-driven program. They're throwing money around all over the place in order to make a lot of people happy and create a constituency for themselves. You know, they're not getting to Moon in the fastest possible way, let alone Mars. So that's the issue. And this is not just the United States government. This is all governments have this two modes of operation. Because the thing is, a government program, unlike a private company, isn't running on its own money. They're running on other people's money. And they're not forced to do the same discipline that a private company is. When I mentioned to you this example of, if you're running your own company, do you spend money in order to please your vendors? The answer is obviously not. Okay. Right. I mean, it's right, simple question. But the government doesn't think that way, or many managers of government programs don't think that way. They say, well, we need support from over here. We need support from over there. So we'll give a contract to this vendor in Alabama, and we'll give another contract to this one in North Dakota, and then whatever. And that's how they think. And that is not the right way to run any enterprise.
Yeah. Maybe that'll change if maybe one party has enough power to pass things, because it's very much caught in a bipartisan vice, so to speak. But speaking of Artemis, what is your assessment of the moon program? I mean, it's been argued that we need to get our feet wet by going to the moon, and it's closer. There's advantages. We could mine the moon more directly. I know with Mars, you have to wait like I don't know, years in order for the planets to be in the right place before you could even do it?
Well, there's two separate arguments here. That's whether we should go to the moon or Mars, and then a separate discussion of if you stipulate that you want to go to the moon, and I do, as you know, disagree with that as our priority. But let's just stipulate for the moment that the task is to go to the moon. I would argue that Artemis is not pursuing that in an effective way, quite the contrary. And the Artemis program was started 6 years ago in the first year of the Trump administration, 2017. And it has accomplished very little. By 6 years into Apollo, we were getting ready to send astronauts to the moon. And they were starting from zero aerospace technology, or virtually so. You know, at the time that we started the Apollo, we had 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. We didn't even know if people could eat in zero gravity. And here we are. We start this program in 2017 after having a space program for half a century. And after having gone to the moon and launched, something like 60 lunar and planetary probes and, whatever, 130 shuttle missions. And where is this thing? And the answer is it's totally bogged down, because the whole premise of the program was, how do we build support for this by giving a lot of different people a lot of contracts? And so, and they came up with this conceit that before we go to the moon, we have to build a lunar orbiting space station, which everybody knew was bunk. To the moon the last time without a lunar orbiting space station. And if you want to know, given their current mission architecture, which involves using the SpaceX Starship as well as the SLS, if you use the lunar orbiting space station, it takes 14 Starship launches to conduct a lunar mission. Whereas if you ignore the lunar orbiting space station, you can do it with 10. It makes the mission harder. It's like me imposing a requirement on you that if you want to fly from New York to Los Angeles, you got to go through Saskatoon. Sorry, we have an airport in Saskatoon and we need you to use it.
I think this is maybe a scientific consensus, is that the best way really is to depend heavily on robotics. And robotics is so advanced right now that it can do a hell of a lot. And they act a lot like drones. I've seen this on YouTube, and we're like, there's a robot in a room, and it's going for jars, opening jars, moving things around, and the human is doing it, and they have sensors on them. It's sort of the way that a drone operator would operate the robot. If we don't have a space station circling the moon, and we are depending on robotics to heavily handle the work of colonization of the moon, setting up mining on the moon or whatever it is we do, can we do that from Earth?
I certainly don't think there's any telerobots, basically remote controlled machines that can do what a human can do now. Now, 20 years from now, it could be very different, but because the field is advancing. But even so, I mean, okay, for instance, the main way that telerobots have been used in space so far has been as tools for exploration, like the Mars rovers, for example. And Steve Squires, professor, he was a professor at Cornell. He ran the Mars exploration rover mission. He's also a field geologist. And he said that after doing this, that there was nothing those rovers could do that he couldn't do in 1,000th the time, literally, had he been on Mars with his geologist's hammer and other tools that he'd been hiking around. And there were plenty of things he could do that they couldn't do at all. I live here in Colorado. This is a famous place for finding dinosaur fossils. And you could parachute 100 robotic rovers into the Rocky Mountains. You never would find a dinosaur fossil. Finding fossils requires hiking long distances through unimproved terrain, doing heavy work like digging and pickaxe work, doing light work, like delicate work, peeling open shales edgewise, just looking around and following up intuitive clues that you're getting with your eyes. And you just, rock counting. There's just no way that the robotic rovers could do that. I myself, at the Mars Society's Practice Mars Station in Utah, found an important dinosaur fossil, which later followed up by professional paleontologists. It's proving to be a major discovery. The place I found it in, you couldn't have gotten a wheeled rover there because it involved a 2-meter drop, which, okay, you don't have to be a mountain climber to climb down 2 meters, but a wheeled rover can't do it. And so my complaint about Artemis is that it's being done in a ridiculous fashion. It's total chaos. The pieces do not fit together. They've got a bunch of pieces. They've all been developed in their own program, and they don't fit together. In Apollo, we had a plan. First, they came up with a plan. Then they said, these are the vehicles we need to do the plan. And then they allocated contracts to build those vehicles. They didn't allocate contracts to all sorts of people to build all kinds of stuff and say, now, how do we make this stuff all go together? It's like trying to build a house by cruising garage sales and accumulating a large assortment of junk, and then telling the architect, here's my stuff, I want you to make a house out of it. And so that's what Artemis is. And that's why it so far has accomplished almost nothing. And it's not to say it couldn't accomplish something, but I think Artemis is still half a decade at least away from getting to the moon. And frankly, given that we got to the moon in 8 years the first time, when we were using these as our computers, I come from that time period, we should have been able to do it in 4 years this time, not 12 or more.
Going back, 30, 40 years, there are times when the United States worked with other countries. We got along somewhat with the Soviet Union, with the Soyuz program and Skylab, and then the International Space Station with Russia. I know right now China's looking to put their own people on the moon. So the people who want to go to the moon, they could maybe see if they can get along with China, maybe. For Mars, do you see this as being primarily a single nation effort by United States, or United States with European Union, or do you see this as maybe something that's best tackled technologically and financially, etc., by the U.S. and China, or U.S. and 3-4 other countries, or how do you see that working?
I could see us doing it together with the Europeans and the other Western Alliance countries, such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so forth. Or I could see us competing with ESA in a friendly competition, and even China as being part of such a competition. Situation with Russia right now is extremely difficult, but even with them, we could try to transcend the differences with, once again, an Olympic spirited competition. And in a certain sense, the race to the moon with the Soviets in the 60s was kind of like that. And it actually was one of the brighter lights in the Cold War. I don't know if you know this, but I was actually in Leningrad when we landed on the moon in 1969. And all the Russians I knew, of course, these were not part of the Soviet leadership. These were chess players or just members of the public who played chess, which was a lot of people. They were very enthusiastic. Now, of course, they would have been even happier had it had been Soviet cosmonauts who had done it. But nevertheless, they could appreciate it. We had excelled in a sport that they respected. So in terms of combined programs, I really think that the only options are other Western Alliance countries. But the idea of an Olympic spirited competition in which we compete for honors with the Chinese and so forth, in terms of who can do the greatest discoveries for humanity in space.
Yeah. So could you tell us a little more about this debate between the moon and Mars that's going on in the scientific community?
Well, it's always been there. If one goes back a ways, the two protagonists, say classically in the 80s, for example, was Gerard O'Neill and his followers pushing the moon, and Carl Sagan and his adherents pushing Mars. And basically, the two different visions of the purpose of human spaceflight. The O'Neillians thought that the moon could be useful for the economic development of Earth orbital space, in particular, supplying material to build giant solar power satellites that would be in Earth orbit and beam the power down to Earth. O'Neill had written a book called The High Frontier, which was basically a business plan based on solar energy being sold to the Earth with the material to build the giant solar satellites coming from the moon. So that was one vision. Sagan was much more interested in science. He was much more interested in going to Mars to resolve the question of the potential prevalence and diversity of life in the universe. Now, I came along, and I wasn't exactly a follower of Sagan, but I was more sympathetic to his position because, first of all, I thought the O'Neillian business plan was fantastical. The idea of beaming power down from giant solar satellites got any number of problems. And there was much cheaper ways to make energy on Earth, such as nuclear power, or even solar power on Earth is cheaper than doing it from orbit and beaming it down. It's just silly. So there was I thought the O'Neill plan was wrong, that is, it was unsound. And secondly, I did think that Sagan's quest to resolve fundamental scientific issues was important. But also, I felt that if we're talking not just about the science of space, but the human future in space, that Mars was the much better prospect than the moon, because it has the full array of materials needed to support life and civilization, whereas the moon does not. Age of space exploration, Mars compares to the moon as North America did to Greenland in the Europeans' age of maritime discovery, which is, Greenland was closer to North Europe, and the Europeans got to Greenland before they got to North America. But basically, it wasn't a place you could build a civilization. And then as an engineer, I did not buy the arguments that you had to go to the moon before you went to Mars, or that the moon was some necessary part of a space transportation architecture that would get you to Mars. It just did not, those numbers did not work out. And so I came into the debate as a Mars adherent, accepting some of Sagan's arguments, accepting the idea from the O'Neillians that you wanted to have a human future in space, that it wasn't just all about science, but rejecting their program. I believe that the key questions in space, and both of those will be resolved by going to Mars.
Yeah. But when we talk about Greenland and North America's continents, we're talking in terms of thousands of miles compared to millions of miles, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And doesn't the proximity of the moon make it in the short term a lot more better to be, exploited commercially for mining and maybe even industry, especially with its light gravity?
Well, I don't think so. Obviously, the moon was easier to reach the first time, and we did that in the 60s, more than half a century ago at this point. But as a place to reach the moon is easier, but as a place to develop a society, it's much worse.
Oh, no. Yeah, I know. Yeah. That's impossible. It would seem like it would be exploitable, more easily exploitable for mining purposes because of the proximity anyhow.
Well, the moon is mostly trash rock. And this is also, frankly, my main problem with the O'Neill program more broadly, which is they wanted to sell a commodity on Earth that is a very ordinary commodity, electricity, that to someone on Earth, it's I'm plugging something into the wall. Will the hair dryer work or not? Okay. And it doesn't matter whether the power is coming from a coal-fired power plant, a windmill, a nuclear power plant. It's just kilowatts. They wanted to get kilowatts from the moon, and the very simple analysis would demonstrate that their business plan would provide power at a cost orders of magnitude more than any of the reasonable terrestrial alternatives. And similarly, if you wanted to get highway gravel from the moon, you could, but it's going to cost a lot more than highway gravel from a rock quarry on Earth. Now, there are places in space where there are some very interesting mineral ores in the asteroid belt, but actually to support asteroid mining, the best place to do that from is Mars. It's much easier to transport to asteroid belt from Mars than from Earth. And so while mining in space is conceivable, provided you can actually refine the materials properly.
They just don't have it's not good to mine. It's just not good to mine.
Well, mostly it's just trash rock. It hasn't had the variety of geological processes that have resulted in concentration of mineral ores on Earth. Okay, copper. Okay, people have been using copper since the early Bronze Age, right? I mean, was a first real metal. It's only present in the Earth's crust in 60 parts per million concentrations on average. However, because there are certain natural processes associated with volcanism and water action on Earth, there's been concentration of copper ore to near 100% concentrations, such that ancient peoples could find it and readily exploit it. The moon hasn't had such processes. The moon, in other words, that there's no place on the moon that, while there's iron present in the soil, for example, there's no place on the moon where you have soil that is good at iron ore as you can find on Earth in, say, Minnesota. And so forth. You can go down the list. There's no place on the moon. People talk about being solar powers on the moon. There's no place on the moon where you can find a silicon dioxide in comparable purity to terrestrial beach sand, not even remotely so. Now, the one thing that there is on the moon that could be of interest is helium-3, which is an isotope of helium that is an attractive fuel for fusion reactors. But we don't yet have fusion reactors. And it's unclear to me that if we did have fusion reactors, that the extra cost of getting helium-3 as compared to just running them on pure deuterium, which we can get from Earth, would be worth the trouble. Is the superior fuel at much greater cost worth it? That's unclear.
I'm a little curious, how do you envision a Mars community looking like? Would it be giant domes, or would it be underground with giant caverns within which we build our homes and have gardens to grow things with an airlock at the front of it so that we don't lose the air to the outside? And how many people do you think do we need minimally for a community? Would it be a couple dozen to start with of highly specialized people? Would it be 1,000 people? What's your vision for a community on Mars?
These are excellent questions. First of all, I believe that the ultimate form of human society on Mars will be city-states, and there'll be quite a variety of them. And they will differ from each other in many respects, including not only architectural solutions, but social solutions, political systems, you name it. Okay. And there may well be a good number of failed experiments, especially where people go to Mars with novel social ideas, and they prove unworkable. The founders of the United States called it a noble experiment. And the ideas they attempted to implement, that is the ideas of 18th century liberalism, were not original with them at all, but couldn't be implemented in Europe because everything was already determined. They had a chance here to start afresh. And in particular, we outgrew the Caribbean sugar plantation islands, which actually at the time of the American Revolution were producing more revenue than the American colonies. We outgrew the Spanish colonies in Mexico and South America and so forth. And the northern United States, which was based on skilled labor, relatively high paid because it was inventing gadgets, technology, outgrew the South, which attempted to deal with its labor shortage through slavery. And if you want to know why the North won the Civil War, it's because it was free. And because as a result of the fact that it was free, all the immigrants went to the North, okay? And that's why it had a larger population. That's why it had more industry. That's why 40% of the Union Army were either immigrants or first-generation Americans, whereas only 3% of the Confederates were. So that you could view the Confederacy, the slave states, as a social experiment too. They were. Everything's an experiment. And it was by freedom. And so I think there could be many different Mars city states. And I'm actually writing a book right now called New World on Mars. What can we create on the Red Planet, where I explore this. And not from the point of view of designing a utopia, but from the point of view of natural selection. What's likely to work? What's likely to emerge? Okay. Some of that is stuff that I really like, that I think will freedom, because I don't believe that a Martian tyranny can be successful because no one would want to emigrate there. It will be outgrown by the free cities. There are other things that would be part of Martian culture, which I don't exactly find repulsive, but which I don't take part in at all myself, such as organized religion. But I do think that certain customs that are necessary for social solidarity will absolutely have a significant role in the Martian city-states that are successful. So there'll be a diversity of social systems, and there'll be a diversity of architectural plans. Now, you mentioned domes. I like domes, but domes can't be gigantic. They can be moderate in size. There's physical limits, which are on the order of 100-meter kind of diameter domes. So not kilometer diameter domes or 10-kilometer diameter, nothing like that. That is,
and would the domes be fairly shallow in height as well?
But you see, here's the thing. Basically, there's laws of engineering that if you have, say, a hemispherical structure, the bigger the diameter it is, the thicker it has to be for a given pressure in order to have the strength not to burst. And so the mass of the dome goes up as the diameter cubed. And things very rapidly get out of hand once you get past the 100-meter or so kind of scale. And so 50-meter domes, maybe 100-meter domes, maybe even 200-meter domes. Okay, linked together by tunnels and passageways and so forth, but not single giant kilometer-sized domes. And you could also have much smaller cylindrical greenhouse kind of structures, not terribly large in diameter, say 10 meters or so, rows of them in which you grow crops, because there's a tremendous advantage to making use of natural sunlight to power plant growth. If you wanted to provide the electricity to light the fields of the United States, you could not. In fact, you couldn't even light the fields of Rhode Island with the amount of power we currently generate, let alone Iowa. There'll probably be some underground agriculture done by LEDs of particular types of crops that maybe have particular high value, or simply crops that we're not really that concerned with providing them with enough light for rapid growth, but just enough light to stay alive, because really they are decorative. They're trees for the park. And so long as it's able to do enough synthetic photosynthesis to stay alive, we don't care. The underground caverns is definitely a possibility, both natural ones, and there are structures on Mars known as lava tubes, which could be very large, up to 100 200 meters in diameter kind of caverns, or they could be made. That are like upscale shopping underground. That's definitely a possibility. There are ideas people have broached, putting a body of water above the inhabited colony. The water provides shielding and a home for raising fish, and it's transparent, so it lets in light while blocking out cosmic radiation. So you could imagine a city in which you look up and there's fish swimming around above your head. I do think that this is actually an important area. That is, once again, the Mars cities will be in competition for immigrants. So they're going to want to offer not only an attractive political system, they want to offer attractive aesthetics.
I got a question related to this. We're talking about humans being able to build structures that can hold off cosmic rays. But how about the problem of Mars being 1/3 the gravity of Earth? Might it be a showstopper? Might we end up finding out that it's, we're just not built for that planet because of the low gravity, and that therefore we cannot really have a sustained existence on Mars?
Well, that's conceivable. I can't tell you just sitting here right now that you're wrong. That's not true because we haven't done the experiment. But I don't think it's true. And I did once ask Buzz Aldrin, who, of course, had been both in Earth gravity and zero gravity and lunar gravity, when he was on the moon in 1/6 gravity, which is about 40% that of Mars, did it seem more like Earth or like zero gravity? So, it was much more like Earth. And your whole orientation becomes normal. The fluids in your head that, you have in zero gravity, fluids from your legs go into your head, and that's why astronauts' faces look fat and everything. And they have all kinds of upsets in their various endocrine systems and stuff like this, because all sorts of things are misfiring. That all goes away. You get normal gravity. There's an up, there's a down. You can put the coffee cup on the table. The fluid stays in it. You can cook the way you cook on Earth, which you cannot do in zero G. And you get some workout walking around, and as opposed to just kind of floating from here to there. So I think that people can adapt to Martian gravity. Now, I do think that people who are born and raised on Mars will find Earth tremendously unpleasant. And so it will be a rare Martian that wants to go back to Earth. They'll only want to go back if the business is really important. Would not go back, as a tourist, because you have to experience triple gravity. They won't be used to it. So I think we'll get some both biologic and, but even before that, cultural diversification as people adapt to Mars, and they don't go to Earth very much. And so you'll have a new culture. But that's a good thing, because in biology, an animal type, for example, is considered successful if it has many different species that represent it. Okay, we have birds for every climate. So birds as a type of animal is very successful. If the only birds that existed in the world were penguins and all the others didn't exist, one would say that the class of animals known as birds was possibly in danger of extinction. It has narrowed itself to one thread.
Yeah. And conversely, for older people, it might actually be a health boon. Less strain on the body living in 1/3 the gravity.
Well, sure. Older people might want to retire to Mars or the moon, for that matter, in that case, because of the heavy gravity of Earth for them.
Yeah. So I know this is a speculative question, but how soon do you think that humans would be able to actually commercially mine space and overcome our growing resource scarcity problem?
Well, I don't think we do have a growing scarcity problem on Earth. I think resources right now are much more plentiful than ever before in history. The cost of materials on Earth today, in terms of labor hours, is much cheaper than ever before, which is the correct way to measure the scarcity or abundance of a resource. How easy or hard is it to get? But I think accessing space resources will enable the establishment of new branches of human civilization in space. Some of them will be sold on Earth. There'll be trade that will allow the space cities to pay for their necessary imports. There's a great deal of high quality iron, not even just ore, but actually metallic iron in the asteroid belt. But I don't think anybody's going to export iron to Earth from the asteroid belt. I think they'll use it out there and on.
Yeah, and hopefully we might be even able to move industry off planet.
I don't think so. That's something that the O'Neillians said, and that's what Jeff Bezos said. I don't see moving steel mills off the Earth and putting them in orbit. I think
in the far future. I'm not talking about immediately there.
Why?
Well, just
we can make steel without pollution on Earth just using nuclear power.
Yeah.
Instead of using coal to reduce the iron ore, use electricity from a nuke.
Yeah, I guess that's true in terms of iron. I mean, in other industries, though, you have waste products and stuff like that, and you get a problem with that.
Once again, so-called waste products are just different arrangements of chemical elements. If you've got the energy, you can rearrange them into more favorable arrangements. CO2, if you have energy, you can turn it into graphite and oxygen, and then you can make carbon-carbon bicycles, which are superior to steel or aluminum bicycles. Something is only waste if you can't use it. Something is pollution if you can't use it. Water is pollution if it floods your land and turns it into a swamp. But in controlled amounts, water is basic to successful agriculture. CO2 is equally necessary as water for agriculture, although you also have to have either land or, if you're farming the oceans, seawater, which has the right amount of the various trace elements in it that phytoplankton need to grow in addition to CO2. They obviously have plenty of water. So everything is a problem if you can't figure out how to use it. But if you can, everything is an asset.
Yeah. So we spoke about The Case for Mars. Tell us a little about your other books.
Well, of course, I have a book called The Case for Nukes, and you interviewed me about that a while back.
Very good.
Okay. And so that's another book that people might want to check out, because we've discussed in this talk here the importance of nuclear power for solving many, many of these issues that are being brought up. I have another book called, The Case for Mars, we discussed. Case for Space, which talks about the entrepreneurial space revolution. I have a book called Merchants of Despair, and it's about Malthusianism. Okay. It is looking at this problem, as it were, from the downside. What happens if you believe this thesis that resources are limited? Well, a lot of people have. And it is a history of catastrophes. Starting with Malthus himself, which was used as a justification for denying food to the Irish during the Irish famines of the 1840s, and to the Indians during the Indian famines of the 1870s. It then became the basis for Nazism. Because look, if there's only so much to go around, the question is who's going to get it? And the Nazis' answers was, we're going to get it. And then post-war, basically a different format that was more socially acceptable than the Nazi format, which was explicitly brutal, the so-called population control movement, and which has perpetrated horrors around the world. And USAID gives very large amounts of money to various governments to impose population control programs. And in some cases, it's a condition for US foreign aid. And this program is racist in the large. It's the advanced sector trying to restrict the population growth of the non-white world. But within each of these third world countries, it's racist in the small, because within each of these countries, there's always an ethnic group that has power and the other people that they hate. And guess which one gets its population control? So in India, it's the low caste untouchables. In Peru, it was the Hispanics imposing population control on the indigenous people, Indian people, Indians, if you will. In Sri Lanka, the Stringalese putting it down on the Tamils and so forth. And horrific programs. And then now we have the global warmists who are saying they have a spin on this. Back in the 70s, the Club of Rome was saying we have to stop economic growth because we're going to run out of fossil fuels. Now the warmists are saying we have to stop economic growth because we're not going to run out of fossil fuels. It's the opposite problem, but it's the same solution. And basically what they're saying is there's only so much room here in this lifeboat. And so our program, that is the warmists say, we want to increase the cost of fuel and electricity, which is a reactionary program. They're pushing it with left-wing coloration, but it's astonishing, actually, that people who consider themselves the friends of the poor are pushing a program to rig up the price of fuel and electricity. It's ridiculous. That's actually an ultra-aggressive program. It's increasing the price of basic goods. Okay, and so there it is. And now I think that, by the way, that global warming is a fact. Okay, but that no more justifies rigging up the price of fuel at the expense of the poor than the fact that Darwin's theory of evolution is a fact justifies Nazism. Okay, yeah, evolution, natural selection, it's true. Does that justify people with power exterminating people with less power? Okay, law of nature, blah, blah. Okay, no, doesn't. So this is my objection to this sort of abuse of science, to push reactionary social programs. You say, oh, if you're against exterminating inferior people, you must be denying the fossil record. Can't you see here's dinosaur bones? You're wrong. What are you, some kind of Bible thumper or something? No, you can oppose extermination of the vulnerable without denying the truth of the fossil record. And you can oppose rigging up fuel prices without denying the truth that the world has warmed by a degree since 1870.
Okay. So, Robert, do you have any final words before we go?
Yeah, sure. Reject the merchants of despair. Okay. Nuclear power is the power of hope. Okay. Infinite resources. And Mars is a vision of hope. Why kill each other fighting over provinces when by working together we can open up planets?
Thank you very much for having joined us on our show again, Robert. It was a real pleasure. And I want to thank everybody here for tuning in. This has been the Ecomodernist channel live. And we are on Twitch as well as the Ecomodernist channel at 2:00 Eastern time and 11 o'clock Pacific. And you could find out more about the Ecomodernist Society at esna.earth, ESNA. That's our initials for our society. And I want to wish everybody a good week. And
Missions first. Peace and justice will follow.
hello, that's it. So long, everybody.
So long.
Bye-bye.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.